Welcome to Occult Archives. You know this show where we uncover the mysteries and myths and the legends behind some of history's most feared books.
Those secrets too dangerous to be read.
Exactly.
Yeah.
From mystical grimoires to...
Yeah, and ancient religious secrets.
Yeah, and today we have a truly fascinating one. It's Maximilian Schele de Vere's Modern Magic, published in 1873.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. This is not your typical, like, dusty old tome. It's actually kind of a snapshot of a time when the lines between what we consider science and the supernatural were a lot blurrier than most people might think.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And what's fascinating about this time period is you've got this explosion of scientific advancement, but at the same time, there's this huge surge in spiritualism. And people are really trying to grapple with these phenomena that don't fit neatly into the kind of emerging understanding of the natural world. And so what de Vere does is he tries to navigate that tension. He's not necessarily endorsing everything, but he's looking for a rationale within all of these kind of seemingly irrational beliefs.
And this is a deep dive, right? So our mission today is to unpack this world of modern magic as it was seen in the 19th century. So we're going to explore historical perspectives on a lot of different things, from black magic to white magic to dreams, visions, ghosts, you name it. And we'll see what insights these kind of older perspectives can offer. And it's important to remember the context.
Right.
This was a time when even scientific bodies were hesitant to completely dismiss certain phenomena. And a lot of that comes from, past mistakes. They had been wrong before.
Yeah, there's this kind of like also a humility that emerges from the French Academy of Sciences, who, when faced with kind of reports on spiritualism, they don't issue this condemnation. They're a little more hesitant because they had been wrong before on things like, meteorites or even the germ theory of disease. So they're like, well, we need to be careful before we dismiss something outright,
Right. And spiritualism itself was gaining a lot of traction. Yeah. De Vere mentions this National Convention of Spiritualists that was held in Rochester, New York in 1868. And they actually came up with like 19 fundamental principles. And it's all centered around this idea of an invisible host of spirits who are constantly guiding humanity. It's almost like a self-help philosophy with like a ghostly support system or something.
Right. And it's not just America. In France, it diverges. You have spiritualists under a guy named Allan Kardec who codified spiritism as like this philosophical doctrine.
Okay.
And then you've got the Spiitists under Pierrard, and they kind of split off. Okay. And so what's interesting about Kardec, he was really influential. He wrote this book, the Book of Spirits, that went through a ton of editions. And the story goes, and who knows if this is true, but that immediately after his death, his spirit supposedly informed his followers of his experiences in the afterlife. And de Vere, he kind of makes this dry remark about it. He's like, well, if the style is the man, then it's laughing.
Yeah.
So there's definitely some skepticism, even within this belief.
So there was a spectrum of like how seriously people were taking it. It wasn't just, oh, this is definitely real and happening.
Yeah. And it manifests in different ways depending on like cultural and religious contexts, right? You've got someone like Professor Russinger in Geneva who is trying to bring together these spiritual revelations with Christian doctrine.
Oh, wow.
And he believes that his medium, this woman, Libna, was divinely inspired.
Oh, okay.
And this is kind of controversial because, it's different from, let's say, the American spiritualism, which was much more freewheeling.
Interesting. And then you have England, which seems to like really embrace spiritualism with a lot of enthusiasm. Yeah. And, it's not just the average person on the street. You have influential figures like Lord Lytton, who was a novelist, and Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a very well-respected scientist, Darwin's contemporary. Right. And there were publications, and there were these famous mediums like Homer Newton, and they were known for psychic abilities. They were known for healing powers, and it really seemed to lend a lot of credibility to the movement, at least in England.
Yeah, and one of the things that is really interesting for you to look at is the chemist, Crookes. Investigating Holmes phenomena.
Okay.
And he was a scientist, right? And he couldn't come to a definitive conclusion, but he basically said, something's happening here.
Okay.
That we can't explain.
Right. So it wasn't like it was all just trickery or fakers.
No. There was something real there, but it was, did it fit into the scientific, the known world at the time? No.
And then in Germany, you have spiritualism being approached more academically.
Yeah, much less kind of, popular,
Right.
less mainstream.
Right, more intellectual. And de Vere mentions all these scientists and philosophers who are writing books and papers, and they're really dedicated to understanding this. But he also kind of hints that, maybe they weren't always as critical as they could have been in their analysis.
Right.
Right. But it's interesting that the planchette, which everybody knows, was actually independently invented by multiple people in different places around the same time.
Yeah.
So there was something in the air.
It's really weird how that works out, isn't it?
Yeah. So now let's get to black magic and white magic.
Right.
Because de Vere has a perspective on this that might surprise you. He doesn't just dismiss black magic as like, mere illusion or the work of demons.
Yeah.
He actually says that some of these effects that are attributed to black magic are actually produced by human beings.
Right, by human agency.
Right. And he sees this as kind of residing in the realm of individual conscience, almost like a potential within ourselves that we don't always realize.
Like there's this power within.
Yeah.
This capacity that maybe we haven't fully tapped into. And what's fascinating is he connects this to the idea of miracles.
Okay.
Right? So if humans can produce what he calls marvelous effects, then it stands to reason for him that a higher power could also enact events that go beyond what we understand as natural laws, especially when there's like a moral or religious purpose at play.
So he's trying to kind of reconcile these seemingly supernatural things with human agency and even divine power.
Right. It's all part of kind of the grand scheme.
And he even brings in like big names like Locke and Leibniz, who acknowledge the existence of miracles.
Right. And Locke, for him, miracles were a big deal. He saw them as kind of credentials for divine messengers. Like, this is how you know this is legit.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about dreams and visions. Because de Vere, he explores so many potential causes for these. And he divides them into those induced by physical means and then those that are from psychological states or even external stimuli.
It's like he's trying to create a taxonomy of all these different states of consciousness.
Right. And some of the physical things are, fasting, narcotics, tobacco, opium, hashish, coca, laughing gas, you name it.
It's like a historical tour of like all the ways people were messing with their consciousness.
Right, exactly. And then you have these vivid anecdotes. Like he talks about Benvenuto Cellini, who had this vision in the Colosseum, supposedly brought on by incense.
Wow.
And this vision, it seemed to foreshadow a real event. Now, de Vere, he is skeptical of Cellini's reliability. But it's a great story.
It's a great story. It makes you wonder, right?
Yeah, totally. And then, he talks about external factors that could trigger visions, like violent movements or even being locked up for a long time. Like he talks about Silvio Pellico, who, when he was in prison, he started having these phantom sights and sounds.
And that's not surprising. Like if you're in solitary confinement,
your mind's going to go somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what I find really interesting is when he talks about the psychology of visions.
Yeah, the internal states, right?
Yeah, like fixed ideas, passions, prejudices, even hidden guilt.
Yeah.
And he suggests that these things can actually manifest as visions outside of yourself.
Yeah. Like it's like your mind is projecting its internal world onto your external reality.
And he even says that these visions can precede big events. Like he talks about Julian the Apostate, who had a vision of his guardian angel turning away from him before he went into this battle where he was killed.
Whoa.
Right. Or Charles IX, who was haunted by visions of the victims of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre.
Ooh.
Right. So this idea that like your internal state, your psychological state can somehow foreshadow what's to come.
That's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
Yeah. And he talks about that too, like people who try to summon ghosts and then they see them because they were expecting to. Or Talma, the actor, who could hallucinate a whole audience of skeletons.
We're not fair.
Right. So it really shows how powerful our minds are.
Yeah. Like even the artist Blake, right? Claiming to paint portraits based on these visions that he saw. It's all coming from within.
And he doesn't just talk about visions. He also mentions these kind of other sensory delusions, people hearing voices or having phantom tastes or smells.
Right, which are less common, he says.
Yeah, but he says that touch is less likely to be fooled this way.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah, and the key point is, even people who are blind or deaf can have visions.
So it's not just about, like, your physical senses.
It's got to be coming from somewhere else.
Yeah, somewhere deeper.
Yeah, and so you have this shift in thinking. Visions used to be associated with great leaders or prophets. But in modern times, de Vere is seeing them linked more to, health issues, physical and mental.
It's like this medicalization of visions in a way.
Right. So he talks about Pascal, who always saw this abyss. Or Blake, with his idealized figures. Or Nikolai, who had ghost apparitions that would come and go depending on how he was feeling physically.
Yeah. And then you have those really individual cases, like Captain Henry Bell, who had this vision that made him start a 10-year translation project. Right. Which he'd been putting off for years. So it's like his subconscious somehow manifested in a vision to, like, get him back on track.
And we can't forget religious visions and conversions. These were still being reported in de Vere's time, like Major Gardner, who had a vision, or Ratisbone, who converted after seeing the Virgin Mary in Rome. So these experiences continue to have a huge impact on people's lives.
Yeah. And you see these cultural differences, too. Like, he talks about the Slavic visions and how they're seen as particularly formidable and repellent.
Yeah, and he attributes that to their, temperament and imagination. And they have these stories of being, like, ridden by invisible men, which is kind of creepy.
Yeah, not exactly the friendly ghosts you see on TV.
No, not at all. Okay, so let's move on to ghosts.
Yeah.
Because, everybody loves a good ghost story.
Of course.
So de Vere, he starts by describing what people typically experience with ghosts.
Right.
The rustling sounds, the feeling of cold, the strange noises.
Classic haunted house stuff.
Right. But then he says, hold on a second. A lot of these sensations, they're probably coming from your own mind.
So even though they feel real, they might not be, like, external to the person experiencing them.
Yeah. And it's not just one person, right?
Yeah.
He talks about how this experience can be contagious. So you have multiple people seeing or hearing the same thing, or even animals reacting.
And that's where suggestion comes in, right? Like, if one person is freaking out, it can influence how others perceive the situation.
Exactly. And then there's this idea of what he calls engastromantic voices. So basically, the person who thinks they're hearing a ghost might actually be unconsciously making the sounds themselves.
Like they're their own ventriloquists.
Yeah, without even realizing it, which, kind of throws a wrench into all these claims of, like, having conversations with spirits.
Right. It's not as simple as it seems.
Now, de Vere does acknowledge that there are reports of objects moving in a way that seems to defy physics.
Yeah, the classic poltergeist activity.
Right. And this is what people often point to as evidence that there's some kind of disembodied spirit interacting with the world.
It's the stuff that really spooks people out, right?
Right, yeah. And speaking of spooked, that feeling of fear, that dread, that's like the hallmark of a ghost encounter.
That cold shudder, right.
Yeah. And he quotes Job, who talks about his reaction to a spirit. And it's that sense of encountering something totally unknown that really triggers that primal fear response.
It's like a disruption of everything you thought you knew about the world.
Exactly. Now, de Vere, he does present some well-documented early accounts of spirit appearances. Like he talks about the poet Simonides, and then there are these stories recounted by Phlegon and Goethe. And he mentions that historically, the church recognized dream visions as a form of divine communication.
Right, so there's this long tradition of accepting these kinds of experiences as legitimate.
Yeah, but then he offers this kind of alternative explanation. He says, what if these disturbances aren't actually the work of disembodied spirits?
Here we go.
But the actions of living people who have temporarily gained some extraordinary abilities.
So not supernatural, but like super normal.
Yeah, like they've tapped into something within themselves that most people haven't. And he uses this example of Counselor Helfeld, who hears these knocks on his window before he's about to sign a death warrant.
Ooh, spooky.
Right. And it makes him rethink the case. But de Vere says this isn't a literal ghost. This is the judge's own subconscious anxieties manifesting as these sounds.
So like a message from his own mind trying to warn him?
Exactly. And he calls this internal process the magic element. So the magic isn't external, it's internal.
It's all about what's going on inside us.
Yeah. And he emphasizes that because a lot of these experiences come from troubled minds, it's really important to be careful and figure out what's real and what's not.
Right, to separate truth from delusion.
Yeah. And this is what led to the creation of a society in London in 1869 that was dedicated to investigating haunted houses and trying to understand these phenomena.
So they're trying to bring a more scientific approach to this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And de Vere mentions all these historical accounts of ghostly disturbances going back centuries. So it's not like this is a new thing.
No, people have been fascinated by ghosts forever.
But of course, there are always those who try to exploit these beliefs.
Oh, yeah. There's always someone trying to make a quick buck or, manipulate people with fake hauntings or staged apparitions.
Right. And he tells this very poignant story of a Protestant minister who's haunted by sounds that are linked to his guilt over a sinner who died. So it's a very clear example of how psychological distress can manifest as these external phenomena.
Right. His guilt is literally haunting him.
But then on the other hand, he presents the case of a dying man whose final words, which were very vengeful, seem to have this lasting effect.
Ooh, interesting.
Right. Suggesting that maybe the soul can continue to influence things after death. And then there's the story of a man who was consumed by revenge, and it seemed to manifest as years of poltergeist activity that eventually stopped. So maybe there was some kind of resolution in the afterlife.
So it's not always clear-cut, right?
No. And then De Vere brings us back down to earth with some more physical explanations, like the artist whose bed knocking was cured by adjusting a tow wire. Right. Or the woman whose muscle spasms were creating these weird noises. And then they discover that people can actually make those knocking sounds voluntarily.
So it's like debunking some of the mystery?
Yeah. But then there's this case of an Alsatian girl who was exhibiting all these things, knocking, sleep-talking, clairvoyance.
Ooh, the whole package.
Right. And it was all linked to this condition called neurosis celiaca. So it shows how complicated this whole mind-body connection is.
Right. You can't always easily separate the physical from the quote-unquote psychic.
And then De Vere talks about the idea of people being completely removed by an unseen power.
Sure.
And he references biblical accounts. And then the story of an Irish steward that was supposedly well documented. But he suggests that a lot of these stories might just be misinterpretations of accidents or extreme psychological states.
So like maybe they wandered off in a daze or something and people assumed they were abducted.
Right. And then there's the classic poltergeist activity, like throwing stones.
Yeah, the case of George Walton is a good example of that. Objects flying around, seemingly impossible to explain.
Right. And those stories are always so compelling. And then there's the ringing bells, which is another common ghostly manifestation. De Vere contrasts the natural explanation, like blood pressure in the head, with these unexplained instances, like the bell at Colne Priory or the vicar's waking bell at Wilcott.
Right. So some things have a simple explanation, but others, not so much.
Yeah. Even John Wesley, who was known for his skepticism, admitted that he couldn't explain the hauntings in his father's house by natural causes alone.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And then there's the Epworth Rectory disturbances, which were really well documented. They had noises, moving objects, even the dog was acting weird. It's a very compelling case, although De Vere does say there's still a chance it could have been people messing around.
Right. Which unfortunately happens a lot with these investigations.
Yeah. And he points out how difficult it is to really get to the bottom of these things because sometimes people who are unhappy or trying to cause trouble get involved.
Yeah, it can be hard to separate genuine phenomena from hoaxes.
And even the famous seeress of Prevorst, Mrs. Hoff, who was studied by Dr. Kerner and seemed to exhibit psychic abilities and poltergeist activity, wasn't completely above suspicion.
Right, because she was in poor health and very suggestible.
Yeah. And Kerner himself, he reported strange things happening in his own house, but it's still hard to know for sure what was really going on.
It's like that line between truth and delusion is always blurry.
Yeah. And it's interesting that Kerner's son, he continued his father's work, but focusing on magnetic healing.
So that's kind of like a bridge to our next topic, which is divination and ecstasy.
Yeah. And De Vere, he goes into all these weird and wonderful methods that people use to induce trance states because they believe that was necessary for divination.
Like gazing into polished surfaces or water or ink or playing cards, even astrology.
Yeah. And he says the goal is to basically withdraw your attention from the outside world and focus inward. And sometimes this leads to unconsciousness or even catalepsy.
So it's about quieting the conscious mind and letting something else take over.
And then he talks about these more extreme practices like the whirling dervishes or shamanic drumming where they're trying to achieve similar states.
But he notes that the results are often kind of meager.
Yeah. And it can take a real toll on the person doing it. Like he tells the story of a priestess who dies after prophesying in a frenzy.
Wow. That's intense.
Yeah. So there's definitely a risk involved with these things, and he defines these theological terms, ecstasis and raptus, which are types of divinatory trances, but they differ in how they come on. And he gives the example of the Scotch Highlanders and their diesel walking, which is a ritualistic walk they do clockwise.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And he tells the story of Robin Oig, who had a vision during one of these walks, and it was seen as an omen.
So the direction you walk in can have a symbolic meaning.
Yeah. And then you have Eastern divination practices, where young boys would gaze into ink or molten lead or shiny objects to try and see visions.
And there's that famous story of the boy of Cairo who supposedly saw Nelson.
Yeah. And De Vere also points out how people often have heightened prophetic abilities right before they die.
Like a final burst of insight.
Yeah. And he mentions Augustus, who had a vision of 40 youths carrying him away, which is exactly how his funeral procession was arranged. It's pretty amazing.
It is. But he also cautions that these kinds of stories are rare and need to be verified.
Right. And then there are the ancient oracles and their pronouncements, which were often ironic or ambiguous.
Yeah, like they'd tell you something, but it wouldn't be clear what it meant until after the fact.
Right. And he gives examples of King Alexander of Epirus and Henry IV of England, who both misinterpreted what the oracles told them.
So even if you get a prophecy, it doesn't mean you'll understand it correctly.
And De Vere talks about the significance of the hand in magic and religion, for blessing, healing, the royal touch.
Right. And this connects to later practices like mesmerism and magnetic passes.
Yeah. And the ancient Greeks, they had this temple sleep, which was similar to somnambulism, but they believed it involved divine intervention.
So like a sacred sleep where you could receive messages from the gods.
And they would use incense, mineral waters, narcotic herbs.
Oh, wow. The whole spa treatment?
Right. And there was magnetic healing by touch, even back then. Like Pyrrhus was known for that.
Interesting.
Yeah. And De Vere suggests that maybe the Sibyls and Druids were actually trained somnambulists.
So it's like these practices have ancient roots.
Yeah. And then he talks about Dr. Pétain, who did this detailed study of a somnambulistic patient in Lyon.
Okay.
This patient could read with his eyes closed, and he could sense hidden objects and all sorts of things.
Wow.
Yeah. And Pétain, he had this concept of a rapport between the magnetizer and the patient.
So there's like this connection between the two people.
Yeah. And then Deleuze, he had this theory of a magnetic fluid. Yeah. But of course, there were people who started faking somnambulism to try and become famous.
Oh, yeah. There are always fakers.
Always. And then De Vere shares all these accounts of clairvoyance that was supposedly induced by magnetic sleep. People finding lost things or having premonitions or describing places they've never been to.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Like there's this story of a young lady who could describe her parents' home in detail, and then this other place in New South Wales where she'd never been.
And she knew details about the people there and the pets?
Yeah. And then there was Hofland, who claimed that during magnetic sleep, you could see inside people's bodies.
Wow.
Yeah. And he said a patient described the structure of the inner ear perfectly.
That's hard to explain away.
And then there were historical predictions, like the King of Württemberg's death or Gustavus Vasa being told he'd be assassinated.
So people were using this for all sorts of things.
Yeah. But of course, you always have to be careful and verify these claims.
Right. Don't just believe everything you hear.
And then there were the Jansenist convulsionaires at Abbé Paris's grave who were having these miraculous cures, and they could withstand incredible amounts of pain.
It's like they were in an altered state of consciousness where they were immune to pain.
Yeah. But it caused a huge controversy, and the king eventually had to intervene. And then there was Great Rakes in Ireland, who was healing people by touch and prayer. So this idea of faith-based healing was still very much alive.
Right. The power of belief.
And then there's stigmatization.
Ooh, yeah.
Starting with Francis of Assisi, whose case was very well documented.
Right. The wounds of Christ appearing on his body.
And De Vere notes that it's often associated with intense religious devotion. And there might even be an element of will involved. Like Joanna of Burgos, her wounds disappeared after she prayed for them to go away.
So the mind can have a powerful influence on the body.
Yeah. And most of the cases were concentrated in Italy and Spain.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then there were all these famous mystics like Henry Suso and John Ruysbrook, who were known for their trances and visions, and John Capistran, who was this really influential preacher who supposedly had ecstatic visions and stigmata.
So these experiences were seen as like marks of holiness.
Yeah. And then De Vere talks about how suggestion and belief can really shape these magical phenomena. Like he gives the example of families in the East Indies who claim to be invisible. And it's always accompanied by this creature called the Gundurua.
So it's like their belief creates the reality.
Yeah. And he talks about how cultural beliefs can influence how we interpret natural events, like Woden and the Wild Hunt.
Right. So what we see as supernatural might just be a different way of understanding the natural world.
And then there's second sight, which is the ability to see your double.
Ooh, that's creepy.
Yeah. And it seems to be more common in northern regions.
Maybe something to do with the climate or culture.
Yeah. And he even mentions the Bible, where Rhoda mistakes Peter for his angel.
Oh.
Yeah. And then there are cases of people actually seeing their double, and it sometimes leads them changing their behavior, like this Oxford student who saw his double and then decided to reform his ways.
So a ghostly intervention.
Yeah. And then there are people who claim to be in constant communication with spirits.
Right. Like the seeress of Prevorst.
Yeah. And they often have health problems.
Right.
And their visions are often accompanied by sounds. And De Vere, he brings up Dr. Kerner again and how he believed in these phenomena. But he also recognized that there was a mix of real experience and imagination going on.
Right. It's hard to disentangle the two.
And then there's this really intriguing ability that some people seem to have to project their thoughts and induce dreams in others, like Counselor Wesserman.
Wow. That's mind-blowing.
Yeah. And there are cases of people psychically announcing their arrival at a prison, or the disturbances in Canning's mother's house, where it sounded like someone was doing carpentry work at night.
But there was no one there.
Right. And then the court preacher, who appeared in full regalia after he died. It's all very strange.
Yeah, it really makes you question what's real.
And De Vere ends by talking about people who have extraordinary control over their bodies and senses.
Right, like they can slow their heartbeat or control their digestion or even make their pupils dilate.
Yeah. And he mentions Caspar Hauser, who had these incredible sensitivities, and Kant, who believed that the mind could overcome disease.
So it's like there's this hidden potential within us that we haven't fully explored.
And he describes a mimic who could simulate death so well that people thought he was actually dead.
Wow.
So it's like, how much of what we see as supernatural is actually just a really skilled human performance?
It's a good question.
Yeah. And De Vere, he concludes by saying that while superstition and deception have definitely muddied the waters, there's still a possibility that some people have these extraordinary perceptual abilities.
And then we need to keep investigating to try and understand these phenomena that lie beyond our ordinary perception.
So what does this all mean for us today? Well, I think it shows that in the 19th century, people were struggling with these same questions about the nature of reality and the limits of human perception.
Right, and we're still grappling with those questions today.
Yeah. De Vere's work, it gives us this fascinating glimpse into a time when science and spirituality were intertwined in a way that we don't really see anymore.
And it highlights the power of belief and the influence of the mind on what we experience.
So we're left with some big questions. How have our understandings of dreams, visions, and altered states changed since the 19th century? Where do we still draw the lines between real experience, psychology, and just plain fakery?
These are things that are worth thinking about. And maybe the most enduring magic of all is the power of the human mind to shape its own reality.
Food for thought. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into modern magic.
Until next time.